Okay, as we approach this first lecture of the week, I want to take a step closer to this concept of empathy. Now, you've heard or we've talked about in different ways this idea of empathy. And I think that often people are all about empathy, but don't always fully appreciate the depth of what empathy is all about. This is more than a good feeling or a good intention. It's actually a discipline that we have to step closer to the people that we desire to serve and support and to truly seek to understand them. And so if for us to do that, it requires something different of us. And so I hope to unpack this a little bit and give us some ways to actually take like real and intentional steps toward what empathy can be like and how it can help your students. So I first want to talk about this idea of stability and instability. You may have heard these concepts before, but I think one of the ways for us to think about instability and stability is that we constantly as human beings are going through stability and instability in the way we negotiate our lives. As a matter of fact, when you got up this morning, you probably had some very clear senses of what your world was going to be like today. And there was even elements of you trying to maintain some stability, a rhythm, breakfast, meeting with a particular person at a particular time, knowing that you had space today to work on something that you have planned for, right? We work hard to create these spaces of stability where in some ways the world is working right for us. But then there are always times when there's instability, when things come up that we don't plan for. We live a life where there are multiple combinations of information and experiences that come our way that we hadn't anticipated. And so that brings that as well. So we do this on a regular basis, but I think we also do this as we think about ourselves as human beings. And some would argue that there's actually sort of a rhythm that we go through. And so what happens oftentimes is that there are young people and people that have the sense of perceived stability. This is a place of where one feels familiarity, a sense of connection with others. They feel a sense of conformity in the sense that they believe something and somebody else that they know that they trust believes in that well, and things just make sense. Okay. But then there's something that happens where I call it tipping point instability, because we're always a bit instability, but there's this moment when the instability sort of takes on a larger form or a larger force, where all of a sudden we can feel a sense of vulnerability. We have this sense of even longing or loss, where we lament that things aren't the way they used to be. We aren't sure what they're going to be in the future. And this can have a lot of impact with that as well. I think a lot of young people feel this, especially in the fall as the summer's over and a new year's beginning, and they're thinking about those things. This also has an intellectual, emotional, and relational upheaval associated with it. So the instability and stability isn't just about knowledge. It's about like this embodiment of our experiences, of which this is all sort of involved. In tipping point instability doesn't necessarily have for the person, have clear answers as to how to move forward. So this is where the vulnerability comes in, right? Like if I don't know how I'm supposed to act or move forward because of a new experience that I've had or information that I've been given and I don't know what to do with, that can create a moment of that as well. And then there's also this sense of just doubt, right? Like doubting what isn't working for me anymore, but I don't exactly know how to move forward. At some point, as a person negotiates and works through their instability, hopefully with the help of a community or a mentor or others as well, they come to this place of what I would call maturing stability. This is where there's a sense of coming home, like they've kind of landed again. There's reconnection, there's reorientation. There's actually, in some cases, renewed energy and vision, where all of a sudden, now that the person has kind of worked through instability and is in this new maturing stability, all of a sudden their world opens up in a new ways, and it gives them new ideas, new creativity, even some courage, and strength because they've worked through that as well. Now, this is where my slide breaks down rather quickly. This doesn't stop with just these three movements. They happen again and again and again and again. So we go through not only maturing with stability, but then eventually that stability gives way to more instability, and we continue to grow. And this is a part of what human beings go through. Now, when it comes to youth ministry, I think we just need to remember that for young people, this instability is much more dramatic. We don't have, like adults, they don't have this sense of power or social capital or control of their lives the way that perhaps we do when we are older. So these feelings of stability and instability are more frequent and oftentimes are more dramatic. And I think it's just important for us to keep these things in mind. So I think why that's important is oftentimes I think what can happen for young people and people is that when we have this sense of perceived stability and we move toward tipping point instability, the impulse is to go back to what's familiar. Okay, we know this even psychologically, right? Sometimes a familiar bad habit is better than an unknown. Okay, we know that that's not good, but sometimes internally it can feel that way. But the reality is that part of formation and working and mentoring and discipling young people is for us to recognize the stability, to name the instability, and give support and scaffolding and tools to help a young person actually move toward a more maturing stability. You can't go around it, you got to go through it, right? And so this will require something different of all of us as we work with young people. It's interesting, and we'll talk more about this probably in some later lectures. The impulse sometimes with older people is to not help the young person work through it, but to actually panic themselves and to pull them back to the perceived stability. So we do things like, no, don't doubt. Just remember that Jesus loves you. Oh, don't think that. Remember that you were baptized. Why would you think that? Because the Bible's true. Just remember that the Bible is true. Remember that. That doesn't always help a young person. Or I'll hear sometimes in youth ministry this idea and this mantra all the time, like, young people come to faith really like before they're teenagers or when they're teenagers, and we lose them after 18. You've probably heard some rhetoric like that before. But if we think about this idea of stability, instability, we just have to recognize the fact that if we are only going to point maturing teenagers who are trying to make sense of their world back to a prayer that they prayed to ask Jesus in their heart when they're 6, I think we just need to realize that while that was significant when the person was 6, it doesn't necessarily carry them through their teenage years. They're looking for something more, and they're looking for something more from you and from me. Okay. Now, as we think about this idea of stability and instability, I think what's really interesting is that I think we've underestimated instability, especially for young people. We know that, number one, it's not as nice and neat and clear as these three pillars show. As a matter of fact, sometimes I think that adults think that when it comes to teenage instability and emerging adult instability, it looks more like this, where most of the time young people are living stable lives. There's a little bit of instability, and then we kind of get them through those episodic, rare moments and get them to the other side of maturing stability, and then we just keep going. When reality would probably dictate that actually young people live more lives of instability than stability. Like I mentioned before, they don't necessarily have the power over their schedules. They're still developing and growing internally and externally as they negotiate a world that's coming at them, and just growing up themselves as they're working through puberty and all that comes with that as well. So there is actually quite a bit of instability. And I sometimes wonder, when we think about ministry, are we assuming when we work with young people that this is the reality or this is the reality? Now, think about that for a second. This would be a great conversation to have with each other. Like, how might these assumptions actually shape the way you think about your youth ministry approach? If you assume that everybody is stable, what will that do to your programming? What will that do to your scheduling? What will that do to the ways you think that you interact with families? Compared to instability, what might that do to show more generosity in our schedules, programming, or families? You see what I'm saying? So this idea of instability is not necessarily us arguing which one is good or bad. It's about empathy. It's about thinking about what's actually going on in young people's lives and how are we stepping into the world that is truly their reality rather than superimposing something on them. And I think that's where it gets us into trouble sometimes. And, I think a lot of times we hear leaders lament, parents lament that kids aren't coming to church, or they don't want to go to youth group, or sports is competing with youth group, or whatever it might be. And, I think there's room for conversation about that, and I don't want to completely dismantle that. However, I find a lot of times it might be more helpful for us to think about this. How do we look for young people where they are and where they're not? Like maybe in their unstable lives, we just have to recognize the fact that they're having part-time jobs. They're trying to negotiate a lot of expectations that are coming their way. They have parents that are divorced and are living in two different parts of town. They're trying to figure out how to make it in this world, and sometimes they just can't make Wednesday night youth group or Sunday morning church, right? We can be angry at that, or we can kind of say, I wonder where they are. I wonder what they need. I wonder what they're hoping for. I wonder what they're working through. Empathy, right? Okay, so here's some self questions for you to think about. First of all, how might youth ministry change if you assumed young people's lives were more unstable than stable, right? We just talked about that. Interesting thing to think about. You should take that back to your team. Just be a great conversation to have, right? I think it would just be like really, really great. Secondly, what assumptions or expectations would shift if you thought about young people as living in the midst of more instability than stability? What topics would you cover? Would your teaching arc change because of that? And how would you talk to parents if this was the reality? Again, your context is unique and different. You have unique relationships with those that you are working with. And I think that that's really important. But perhaps this perspective of instability and stability opens up new possibility for the ways that we think about how we can best support young people. And that seems to be what we really want, right? Okay, hope that's helpful.